Hey, Suzann. Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Great to have you in the class. Wanted to send you a reply video here in week one. Gives me a chance to welcome you a little more directly to the class and kind of get the conversation started. Give you some reaction to what you've written in both forums this week, which is excellent, by the way. You've got some good stuff in both discussions, and I want to highlight a few things that you're doing that I hope you'll just continue to kind of lean into in the weeks ahead. First of all, I just want to kind of resonate with what you draw from Grebe, Catherine Grebe, that in a thesis statement to a letter like Romans, as we might expect, it's layered. I think it's best to understand as pregnant with various possibilities that are evoked but emerge only as the letter develops, as opposed to thinking that we could capture its entire significance just by studying it here in the first chapter to the letter. So I think that's just a good kind of judicious interpretation to see what it evokes, but be open to how it might develop in the rest of the letter. Along these lines, I guess I want to emphasize more than Witherington does the concern of Habakkuk and Paul with the faith of God, not simply with the faith of the just one or God's covenant partner, however we conceive of the human. I think that we don't want to lose sight of the presence of the faith of God in the picture of Habakkuk. This is, of course, sort of made explicit in the rendering of the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. It's discussed in some of the commentaries. But the reason I want to emphasize it is that Paul is going to talk explicitly about the faith of God in chapter 3, still building on this thesis statement. And in Habakkuk, the faith of the just that the word of the Lord calls to the prophet and to his people to embody depends on the faith of God. It depends on trusting God that God will act in good faith. So you can't have faith in God without a faithful God. And that I think is part of what Habakkuk is reassuring its audience, including us, that God is trustworthy and therefore the just by faith can live. This faith of the just is in contrast explicitly in Habakkuk with the ways of the arrogant, the ways of the prideful, people that are exploiting the disparity in power so as to take advantage of the vulnerable. And that is what Habakkuk is urging the audience against, not caving to that tendency to grow cynical, to exploit the vulnerabilities of others in such terrible circumstances that his generation finds themselves in, um, and instead to live in a way that trusts God to provide and therefore is a way of faith. This is going to be manifest as generosity with others, especially vulnerable others, as opposed to taking advantage of them. And that's going to play directly into what Paul is saying in Romans, as we'll see in the next stage of the argument, teaching against the tendency to judge one another or rule over one another, to treat one another arrogantly in that sense, and instead to be people of faith that trust God as the judge, that trust God's work to shape the community, as opposed to trying to grab the reins of the community by appealing to the law in a certain way or something along those lines and trying to control what should be left to God's government, trusting God to provide. So that I think is how Habakkuk is then going to play into um, Romans, and how what Paul says is that Habakkuk shows that the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, from the faith of God that produces the fruit of the faith of the human. And this is exactly how the gospel's power is spreading. I think, against Witherington here, although somewhat sympathetic with him, that we should recognize Habakkuk as open to a sort of messianic horizon. So I think Witherington's right that faith has to make sense in the generation of Habakkuk. It's not primarily the faith of the Messiah there, but I think that it is a word to Habakkuk's generation that is open to a messianic horizon as that word grows with time and with the generational life of the people of God. And so the faith of God and the faith of the human reach their fullness in the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one. That is a life of faith that Paul is teaching is contagious. It spreads by this spirit of resurrection and is going to spill out in the way people are hospitable to each other, are even patient with enemies, Paul's going to say in Romans 9 to 11, learning to kind of prize the gifts of one another and to consider the needs of others as they gather around a table, begin to share their goods, their life, their possessions, coming from very diverse backgrounds and sometimes competitive backgrounds that have to get sort of worked out in the way they sort of express their life together in Rome and beyond. So that I think is kind of where it's going. And you've got some great initial lines here that point in that sort of direction. So good work on that. I also turning here to the second response forum. I'm glad you did feel that like repetition of the justice of God or justice is just a programmatic term of Romans to register in a new way. And I think that this can help us to appreciate what for Paul is um, a political commitment, not exclusively or even primarily, maybe in the sense of electoral politics that's familiar to us, that certainly is related. But for Paul, the political life of Christian discipleship is about the way the community shares power with each other, the way they treat their neighbors, the way that they relate to corrupt authorities, the way that they share their economic goods with each other. This is a political life, even though for them there's no voting or representative government or that sort of thing. It's already politically significant in Paul's teaching for the community to be naming Jesus as Lord and to be living in certain ways that express that lordship of Jesus, even under the nose of the Roman Empire there in the capital. So lots of good stuff here that we'll be talking more about, but mostly just want to welcome you to the course this way, tell you really good work here in week one, and I'm looking forward to more conversation with you and others throughout the summer. You don't need to reply to this video unless you want to. If you want to, of course, that's great. But if you don't reply with much, just at least maybe write received or something like that in response to this so that I know that the video came through and you were able to view it. Thanks again, Susann, for some great work in week one. Looking forward to more in the weeks ahead.